Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Joyanna. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. I want to start. You have this great bird's eye view into what parents in DC are experiencing as they navigate the school system, get their kids into certain schools, deal with issues of discipline, special education programs. And I know that there's been a big focus in the press and in the public conversation around a lot of the scandals that have plagued DCPS. But more broadly, what are parents experiencing right now? What's the big picture of where the school system is, 10 years after really the reforms began?
Yeah, so what we're hearing from parents is, so they come to our office to share barriers that they're having with their children who are experiencing the school systems. And I say school systems because clearly in DC we have our traditional public school system and we have our charter schools. And so when they come to us, they're often sharing things like, I can't get my child enrolled, we're homeless, right? So there's some complications there. I think my child is struggling academically, or my child continues to get suspended, and I have questions about whether what's happening in terms of excluding my child from school is actually working, because I don't think it's working, right? And so those are the specific questions or concerns that they bring to our attention. But we've also heard from a number of families questions around being 10 years out, as you mentioned, from school reform efforts. Is this working? And so, I'm not here today to talk about fully the governance structure and whether we should change it. But certainly, families, and you're a mother and I'm a mother, we care about whether our children through public schools or any other school can really reach their fullest potential. And there are a lot of questions about whether the systems that we have in place can do that for them.
So what are you seeing in those systems? Where is it working? Where is it not working? Who's finding the right fit for them? Who's not? And where in your work are you able to help parents?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of families, it really depends on where you live in the city.
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate thing. And so we found from our data, almost 70% from last year's data of our students came from wards 5, 7, and 8.
Sorry, and you mean of the students that you're getting?
That we're providing support to, right? And so they're having a lot of issues. And so, sometimes I go to dinner parties and they'll say, oh, you're the education ombudsman. I don't need you, right? And in fact, some of them don't need me.
Right.
And so I think that is where we're trying to figure out, we have families who are dealing with food scarcity issue coming from, the kids are coming from single parent households, and they're dealing with violence, both, to and from school. So there are a lot of issues that are compounding themselves, and then they're entering their classrooms. And so what we do is really talk about facilitating conversations with the school to make sure that we could work through the issues that they presented. And we find that, in many instances, schools don't always know what's happening at home.
Right.
And so we bring that other perspective. And when you have schools that have, I've worked at a school, a lot of students, it's hard to really focus on one particular child. And so that's what we do well. We kind of bring that student back to the attention of the principal or the special education coordinator or others and say, have you really considered these other things, these other factors that are happening? And can you take another look at this student? They're having some difficulties.
I mean, these are huge issues that you're dealing with when you're talking about homelessness or food scarcity or violence at home. Those go way beyond the education in a traditional sense. Do you feel like the schools are prepared? And what kinds of resources can they devote to these kids who are coming in with needs that go beyond kind of just learning?
Right. So very difficult questions, right? What we often do is really try to engage in options exploration. So we will, if a family is experiencing some difficulty, I can give a good example. There was a third grader who attended a traditional public school, and originally the parent came to us and said, I want to enroll my child, and this is his in-boundary school, and they won't allow me to enroll my child. And so immediately, we contacted the school, and the school principal honestly said, I don't want that child to come to my school, and there's a reason. Well, the reason they said, the principal said, is she said, he had a lot of difficulties here in the past, and then we've looked at his records, and he's been at other schools and been disciplined a lot, and we're finally starting to get our school culture and climate correct here, and I've done a lot of work to ensure that, and he will be disruptive to his particular classroom. And so we said, well, of course, he has to be able to come here, right? He has a legal right to come here. But let's continue to dig in to see what's going on here. And so what we did in that particular case, after speaking to the principal a number of times, she said, well, I actually could use your help. And we are a neutral party, so we're here to support both parties. And so she said, we do have some concerns, and we think that perhaps he could use an IEP. But if we go to the central office, it takes a long time they'll take the full 120 days to go through the evaluation process.
Can you explain for people who aren't familiar what an IEP?
Individual education plan, right? So it's a plan that outlines services for a particular child if they're diagnosed with a disability. And so in this particular case, he was very disruptive. He finally received an IEP, was found eligible for an IEP, and actually he went from being very disruptive and being suspended all the time to actually being a model citizen.
That's nice. And I know I was looking at some of the data that you guys provided about what are the complaints you're hearing from people or what are the concerns. And I noticed that special education really is the plurality of the concerns parents are coming with. What are the problems that parents are facing, and what are you guys able to provide them?
Right. So I think many times families come to us and they think that their child may need an IEP, but they're not sure, right? What they said, and as I mentioned earlier, is sort of, my child is struggling academically, or he's been suspended 7 times this year. So the school is saying he has behavioral problems, but I think it's coming out of something else, right? And so we do speak to the school about sort of what are the interventions that you're using now? Do you think the child needs something? And we help them or encourage them to evaluate the child to see if they're in fact eligible for services under an IEP. And for some kids, we found that there were undiagnosed disabilities, and that's why they were behaving in a certain way, or that's why they were struggling academically. And so we do things like attend the IEP meetings. We find for a lot of parents that they don't know the terminology, so we provide that support to them. And then we also provide support and technical assistance when needed to schools about sort of what children's rights are under IDEA and what the process really should look like.
So the district has had a couple big scandals this year, obviously. Most notable probably the graduation rate scandal. And I do hear parents saying a lot about their questions of trust with the school system. What are you hearing from parents? Is that something that parents specifically at Ballou are coming to you? Are they worried about their kids and whether their graduations will look legitimate? And how are you helping them?
Yeah, so for the families that have come to us, there are still a number of questions around the seniors this year and then the juniors, the rising seniors, right? So families, I think, often trust their school systems initially, right? So they believe that if their child is graduating with a diploma, that is worth something. And so I think there's just a lot of confusion right now about whether my child's going to graduate. I think you've seen the data. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 46% are on track, 20-something%, I don't quite remember, are moderately off track. And so,
do you know if those numbers are still current?
Those are the numbers I saw very recently in the last week or so. So, and so there are a lot of concerns. But at the end of the day, I think what I'd like to see families move to, in the direction I'd like to see families move into, is not so much whether your child has a high school diploma, but what is it worth, right? So can I get a job where I can be an electrician, so I could be career ready, or can I can I go to college? And am I ready to go to college? Am I prepared to do so? And so I think there are just a lot of questions swirling around families about, what does this mean? How do I get my child through this year to graduate, and what happens in the future?
And are parents sticking with the school? Are they trying to move their kids to charter schools, or what are they doing?
I have not heard that families are moving their children to charter schools, but I'm sure that's quite possible. But yeah, a lot of families want to stay because their children are seniors now.
And and they've invested all those years.
Right.
That makes sense. Another thing I wanted to hear your views on and what you're hearing from parents about is this question of school discipline. And I know the DC Council is now considering a bill that would really restrict how much what kinds of infractions teachers could suspend students for. Do you have views on that as a mechanism for dealing with the school discipline problem, and what are you hearing from parents on it?
Yeah, so I've heard a lot of views over the months. I was originally part of the working group that was convened by Chairman Grasso, and it is very controversial. The way I look at it is that a lot of the families that we have worked with have expressed concerns about exclusionary practices. And so some were formal, so there was a formal suspension, or some were informal. So, can you pick up your child, and then days go by and there's nothing documented, right? So it can vary.
Really?
And so from my perspective, what I care most about is making sure the kids are in the classroom. And unfortunately, here in DC, there is a disproportionate suspension rates that we've seen for kids of color and students with disabilities. And so certainly from my perspective, I think we do need a mechanism to ensure that kids stay in the classroom.
In part because there's such an impact on a student's performance over the long run.
That's correct, right.
Yeah. Do you happen to have those numbers on what are the disparities right now between suspension rates among the different groups?
Yeah, so one that comes to mind is that, and I think I'm close, I might be a little off, but for students of color, for African American students, I think it was something like 7.8 or 9 times as likely to get suspended than a white student.
A white student. And is that across ages too, or are you seeing that more in high school?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we do see actually a number of suspensions in middle school and high school, and I think what's different about the two sectors is that DCPS currently can suspend up to 90 days, and then depending on the violation or the infraction, right? And then charter schools don't typically suspend that long. They don't have anywhere for you to go, right? So there is another place like Choice Academy that's available for DCPS students, but for charter schools, they don't have a place, so typically they range between 2 to 5 days. Their suspensions.
I just want to let the audience know that in a minute I'm going to go to questions, so start thinking about what you would like to ask. One of the big issues that a lot of younger parents face, obviously, is the school lottery and the enrollment process, both of which are pretty complicated and ask a lot of parents in terms of research and just paperwork. How are you finding parents able to cope with that, and are there disparate effects just of the process of getting your child enrolled?
So I would say we support families with understanding the options that they have. And so understanding sort of what does it mean to have an inbound to school? Okay, when do you need the lottery? What kind of programming might your child like? Would you like a dual language program? And so really talking through their preferences. My school, DC, does a great job in terms of providing support to families in that, but we do provide some additional support if they need that. But the process isn't the problem, right? The problem is really not having enough quality choices. And so, and what we see largely in DC, is that where you live matters. And so while we have a system where we talk about, quality choices, irrespective of your zip code, that's not the system that we have currently. And then we also have another wrinkle, I think, in terms of school choice, which is even if you get into a school across the city, how do you get there?
Yeah.
Right? And so a lot of families, I mean, I have an almost 3-year-old. When we looked at the choices through the lottery, we looked at before and after care. How would we get there? I'm not a morning person, right? So it can't be across the city through traffic. I'll never get there, right? And so families have expressed to us the difficulty, and even grandmothers who are taking care of their children, their grandchildren, carrying multiple children on the metro, on the bus. I mean, and that is an ongoing challenge. I think that's something the cross-sector task force is looking at as a recommendation in terms of transportation.
And what about the providing more quality choices across the wards?
The city is looking at.
Yeah. All right, we're going to open it up to the audience. There's a microphone traveling around in the back, so.
Hi, I'm Jessica Sutter.
I know,
hi, Joy. How are you?
Good.
So I live here in DC. I'm running for state board here in DC, and I have a question connecting back to the segregation panel earlier. We only have one set of tax dollars here in DC, but we still see patterns of segregation that are based on real estate, based on boundaries. So how can we better attack that as a city, assuming that we value integration, we see the benefits of it, given that we're not seeing places secede, and our choice process hasn't yet resulted in integration in the way we may have hoped?
Yeah, it's a great question. One I've been struggling with recently. So a lot of people have a lot of opinions about how we should do that. So my understanding is Boston was busing people, right? You know, I know Nicole Hannah-Jones has talked about going sort of to the equivalent of your neighborhood school or in-boundary school and integrating that way. I do think that one of the challenges that I think we have in our city is that we really think of education as being sort of for my child, right? It's very individualistic, right? So it's like, my son's name is Malachi. I want him to get into a good school. I care kind of about what happens to the other kids, but I'm really focused on getting him into a good school.
What's best for my child?
What's best for my child? And that's a starting point as a parent. That's a good starting point. But I think that if we actually had a sense of moral responsibility around sort of that child is actually our child, right? They're all of our children, and that we really need to make sure that we have quality options for everyone. So if you do that in a way that you go to your neighborhood school, that's great. But I think that ultimately, sort of that's a one-off. That's how many families are going to do that. And I think what we really need to focus on is if we care about it being, you know, our children really having access to education and quality education across the city, then I think we need to also broaden the conversation to community stakeholders, to families, to other people who are actually really invested in the system to really start those conversations. And I think largely what's happened is while we have community forums and other things, there's not meaningful public engagement.
Also, looking around for questions.
No one has a question for me? Should I be offended?
Oh, there's one.
The last thing I want to do is offend the Ombudsman.
That's okay. I can handle it.
So you offer a wonderful service, but only for those that are able to access it or become aware of it. So how is it that that process takes place?
In terms of raising awareness around our
Yeah, that
service?
you're a resource that's available to me as a parent if I'm dissatisfied with, say, the level of service that I'm getting, or the lack of responsiveness, or how do I even know? How am I informed as a constituent that you are a resource that is available to me?
Yeah.
And also, do you offer your services in other languages?
That's a good question. So the first part of your question is something that I grapple with every day, right? So we are intentional about being at different community meetings throughout the city. We have a really small staff. So I was the first member of the staff for some time before we received some funding for additional people over time. And so what we find is that families often share our services once they're pleased. Once they've had a good experience, they'll share it with other families. But please, everyone, share our services. We are online. But, you know, and then we've also thought about sort of where are we targeting. And so, for instance, last year we did put billboards, I guess, so to speak, or advertisements in Metro in wards 5, 7, and 8 because we knew those were areas that had the greatest need. You had a second question, I'm sorry.
Languages.
For first-gen parents, are they accessible in other languages?
Yeah, so we do use the language access line, and then we actually have a few people within the State Board of Education who speak other languages, especially, particularly Spanish. And so families do have access to our services, and we are intentional about that. And then we have translated a number of our core materials, brochures and things like that into a number of other languages.
All right, last question. All right, in the absence of a final question from the audience, I'm just going to ask you, other school districts, it's pretty rare to have an ombudsperson, is it not? How did that get started in DC, and how does it kind of compare with what other school systems are doing right now?
Right, so there was one outlined when school reforms came about in 2007. I am the second ombudsman, so there was one that I believe was housed in the mayor's cabinet a number of years ago. And then the funding sort of dissipated somehow. And then a few years ago, maybe more than 4 years ago, the council, I believe under David Catania, decided that he needed to restore funding for an ombudsman, and over time, Chairman Grasso has provided additional funding over the years.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much,
Thank
Joyanna.
you.
This was great to talk to you.